The air in the royal palace of Madrid in late September of 1833 was thick not with grief, but with the suffocating weight of anticipation. King Ferdinand VII, the man they had once called El Deseado, the Desired One, was dead. For days his body had lain in state, a bloated, gout-ridden testament to a life of excess and cruelty. But now, with the public mourning concluded, a far more private and sordid task was at hand. A royal physician, a man of steady nerves and practiced discretion, was summoned to the darkened chamber. His duty was not merely to embalm the royal corpse for its final journey to the crypt at El Escorial, but to perform a task of immense political sensitivity, to preserve the king's remains in such a way that they might endure, a perpetual symbol of Bourbon continuity. What he was not told, but what he would soon discover, was that his true task was to confront and conceal a secret that had festered at the heart of the Spanish monarchy for nearly half a century, a secret of flesh and blood that had shaped the reign of a tyrant and bled a nation dry. As the heavy doors sealed behind him, leaving him alone with the silent monarch, the physician approached the great bed. The smell of decay was already beginning to challenge the cloying incense. He pulled back the velvet sheets, and for a moment, he froze. He had seen death in all its forms, treated the ravages of war and plague, but he was not prepared for this. The king's body was a landscape of pathologies. The limbs were swollen and distorted by decades of crippling gout, the joints twisted into painful, permanent angles. The skin was sallow, the face puffy and marked by the vacant slackness of his final, paralytic stroke. Yet, it was not the disease that held the physician in a state of horrified fascination. It was the king's fundamental anatomy. Beneath the ceremonial nightshirt lay the source of Ferdinand's lifelong torment, the wellspring of his rage and paranoia. The monarch suffered from a severe congenital condition, macrogenitosomia, a grotesque and startling enlargement of his sexual organs. It was a deformity so pronounced, so far beyond the realm of normal human variation, that it seemed a cruel joke of nature, a biological mockery of the divine right he claimed to possess. In that silent, candlelit room, the physician understood. He was not looking at the body of a king. He was looking at the genesis of a tragedy, the physical manifestation of a dynastic curse that had been paid for not by the man on the bed, but by his wives, his children, and his entire kingdom. How could one man's private shame, his corporeal grotesquerie, have caused such a vast and public ruin? This was the story etched into the dead king's flesh, a story of how a secret deformity fueled an insatiable obsession, turning a monarch into a monster and his kingdom into a charnel house. The roots of Ferdinand's affliction ran deep, twisting back through the shallow gene pool of European royalty. The Spanish Bourbons had inherited the throne and the proclivity for genetic maladies from their predecessors, the Habsburgs. For centuries, these two houses had intermarried with a reckless disregard for consequence, wedding cousins to nieces, uncles to cousins, all in a desperate bid to keep power consolidated within the family. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite that afflicted generations of Spanish and Austrian rulers, was the most visible sign of this systemic inbreeding. But it was only one flaw among many. By the late 18th century, the blood of the Spanish Bourbons was a toxic cocktail of recessive traits and accumulated defects. Ferdinand's father, King Charles IV, was a well-meaning but weak and indecisive ruler, a man more interested in hunting and clockmaking than in governance. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, was the opposite, ambitious, domineering, and scandalously entangled with the prime minister, Manuel Godoy. Their court was a nest of intrigue, sycophancy, and moral decay. A place where whispers held more power than decrees and loyalty was a currency traded for fleeting advantage. Into this dysfunctional environment, Ferdinand was born in 1784. From an early age, it was clear he was not a robust child. Sullen, withdrawn, and possessed of a brooding intelligence, he was profoundly shaped by the poisonous atmosphere of his parents' court. He saw his father's weakness and despised it. He saw his mother's flagrant relationship with Godoy and felt the sting of public and private humiliation. He grew up feeling like a stranger in his own home, a prince overshadowed by a commoner who held the affection of his mother and the power of the throne. This psychological isolation was compounded by the growing awareness of his physical abnormality. While the precise details of his youth are shrouded in the deliberate obscurity of royal protocol, it is impossible that such a significant deformity could have gone unnoticed. In an era where the body of the monarch was considered the symbolic body of the state, a divine vessel of strength, perfection, and virility, Ferdinand's condition was more than a personal embarrassment. It was a state secret, a potential source of dynastic shame. He learned early to hide his body and his feelings, cultivating a mask of sullen indifference that concealed a roiling cauldron of resentment, insecurity, and a desperate, gnawing need to prove the masculinity he felt nature had perversely overgranted in form but denied him in essence. The immense pressure placed upon a European monarch to produce a legitimate male heir cannot be overstated. Succession was the bedrock of stability. A king's primary duty, beyond all matters of statecraft and war, was to secure the dynasty by placing a son upon the next step of the throne. It was the ultimate expression of his potency and his divine mandate. For Ferdinand, this universal expectation became a personal obsession, magnified horrifically by his secret shame. Fathering a child, a son, was not just a political necessity. It was an existential crusade. It was the only way he could validate himself, the only way to silence the whispering doubts he imagined in every courtier's glance. It was the means by which he could transform his grotesque physical curse into a demonstration of unparalleled virile power. His body, the source of his humiliation, had to become the instrument of his ultimate triumph. This singular, all-consuming drive would become the engine of his reign, a destructive force that would consume the women he married and plunge his nation into a cycle of violence and instability that would last for generations. He was a prince trapped not just by court intrigue, but by the prison of his own flesh, and he would make the entire world pay for his confinement. The first true eruption of Ferdinand's toxic ambition occurred in 1807. By then, he was the 23-year-old Prince of Asturias, consumed by hatred for Manuel Godoy, whom he blamed for all of Spain's ills and his own personal marginalization. Encouraged by a clique of disgruntled nobles and his own tutor, one Escoiquez, Ferdinand entered into a clandestine correspondence with a man he saw as a potential savior, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. He plotted to oust Godoy, force his father's abdication, and seize the throne for himself, believing the French emperor would support his coup. The plot, known as the Conspiracy of the Escorial, was amateurish and quickly discovered. Godoy's agents intercepted the incriminating documents, and Ferdinand was arrested and confined to his chambers. Faced with exposure and charges of treason, the future tyrant's true character snapped into sharp focus. He showed no loyalty, no honor, no courage. He immediately broke down, betraying every single one of his co-conspirators by name in a desperate, groveling letter to his father. He wrote another to his mother, begging for forgiveness in the most pathetic terms. By sacrificing his allies, he saved himself. His parents, perhaps out of foolish affection or fear of a greater scandal, pardoned him. But the episode was a stark revelation. It demonstrated his capacity for ruthless betrayal, his inherent cowardice when personally threatened, and his belief that his own survival justified any duplicity. It was his first major play in the game of power, and it taught him a valuable lesson. Promises were meaningless, and people were disposable. His perceived savior, Napoleon, would soon prove to be his master manipulator. In 1808, popular discontent with Godoy boiled over in the tumult of Aranjuez, a public uprising that finally forced Charles IV to abdicate in favor of his son. Ferdinand was king for a moment, but Napoleon had his own designs on Spain. He refused to recognize Ferdinand's legitimacy and, under the guise of mediating the family dispute, summoned both Ferdinand and his parents to the French city of Bayonne. It was a trap elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. Once on French soil, far from her base of power, the Spanish royals were helpless. Napoleon alternately bullied and cajoled the dysfunctional family. He berated Ferdinand, while flattering his parents, expertly playing on their resentments. In a scene of humiliating family drama, Charles IV was induced to reclaim his throne, only to immediately cede it to Napoleon. The emperor then forced a stunned Ferdinand to formally abdicate as well, handing the crown of Spain over to Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. In a matter of days, Ferdinand had gone from celebrated new king to a powerless prisoner. He was sent into a gilded exile at the Château de Valençay, where he would remain for nearly 6 long years. This period of captivity was the crucible in which his future tyranny was forged. The public humiliation, the loss of his crown, and the powerlessness of his situation curdled his already potent resentment into a vengeful, absolutist ideology. He would spend his exile writing fawning, obsequious letters to Napoleon, congratulating him on his victories over the Spanish people who were fighting and dying in his name. He was playing a long game, learning that the path back to power required absolute hypocrisy. When he returned, he would ensure no one could ever take anything from him again. While Ferdinand languished in his French chateau, Spain convulsed. The Spanish people, outraged by the French usurpation, rose up in a brutal, nationwide war of independence, known as the Peninsular War. Guerrilla fighters, aided by British forces under the Duke of Wellington, fought a bloody war of attrition against Napoleon's armies. In the midst of this chaos, a new political idea was born. In 1812, liberal reformers, nobles, and intellectuals convened a parliament, the Cortes of Cádiz, and drafted a revolutionary document, the Spanish Constitution of 1812. It was one of the most progressive charters of its age, establishing a constitutional monarchy, curtailing the power of the church and the aristocracy, guaranteeing individual liberties, and proclaiming the sovereignty of the nation, not the king. They drafted it in the name of their absent, imprisoned monarch, Ferdinand VII, whom they idealized as a victim of tyranny and the great hope for a new, modern Spain. They called him El Deseado, the Desired One. In March 1814, with Napoleon's empire crumbling, Ferdinand was finally released. He crossed the border back into Spain not as a grateful constitutional monarch, but as an avenging angel of absolutism. The adoring crowds who greeted him, and the powerful conservative factions who saw the Constitution as a mortal threat, confirmed what he already believed. The nation did not want liberty, it wanted a master. Presented with a copy of the Constitution by a hopeful delegation from the Cortes, Ferdinand delayed, calculating his move. Then, on May 4th, he showed his hand. He issued the Valencia Manifesto, a decree declaring the Constitution of 1812 null and void, and all acts of the Cortes of Cádiz illegal. He did not reform it. He did not amend it. He tore it up. With that single act, he extinguished the dream of a liberal Spain and unleashed a wave of brutal repression that would define his reign. The White Terror began immediately. Liberals, constitutionalists, and anyone suspected of progressive sympathies were rounded up. They were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Universities were closed, freedom of the press was abolished, and the Inquisition, that dreaded symbol of medieval obscurantism, was restored. The Desired One had revealed himself to be El Rey Felon, the felon king. His years of humiliation were over, and he would spend the rest of his life making his people pay for them. His power was now absolute, unchecked by law or parliament, and he would immediately turn his attention to the other great project of his life, the obsessive, desperate, and catastrophic quest for an heir. His marital career had begun long before his return to power, during his time as Prince of Asturias. In 1802, he was wedded by proxy to his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. It was a purely political match, designed to strengthen ties between the two Bourbon courts. From the beginning, the marriage was a disaster. Maria Antonia was intelligent, cultured, and spirited, qualities that were utterly lost on the sullen and suspicious Ferdinand. She found him boorish and repulsive, and was horrified by the decadent, intrigue-ridden court presided over by her mother-in-law, Maria Luisa and Godoy. The two young royals developed a profound mutual loathing. More critically, the marriage was barren. Maria Antonia suffered two miscarriages in 1804 and 1805, events that only heightened the political tension and Ferdinand's personal frustration. He and his faction blamed the Queen and Godoy, baselessly accusing them of poisoning the princess to prevent her from producing an heir who could challenge their influence. When Maria Antonia died in 1806 from tuberculosis, the rumors of poison intensified, creating a convenient political narrative for Ferdinand supporters. For Ferdinand himself, the experience only solidified his view of women as fragile, unreliable vessels for his dynastic ambitions, and marriage as a battlefield where his enemies sought to thwart him. After his restoration to the throne and a decade of forced celibacy, the 32-year-old king's need for a wife and heir was more urgent than ever. In 1816, he entered into a double marriage pact with the Portuguese royal family. He would marry his niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal, while his brother, Don Carlos, would marry her sister. Maria Isabel was just 19 years old, said to be gentle and beautiful, but she was stepping into a nightmare. Her new husband was no longer the sullen prince, but a hardened, absolute monarch, a man whose personal insecurities were now backed by the full power of the state. The true horror of the marriage, however, was physical. The intimate realities of her union with a man afflicted by Ferdinand's severe macrogenitosomia would have been a source of profound physical pain and psychological trauma for any woman, let alone a sheltered young princess in an age of ignorance and piety. Court chroniclers, masters of euphemism, would never speak of it directly, but the consequences were impossible to hide. The marriage was a duty to be endured, a terrifying ordeal undertaken for the good of the state. Despite the trauma, Maria Isabel did her duty. In August of 1817, she gave birth to a daughter, also named Maria Isabel. The king's joy was immense, but tragically short-lived. The infant was frail and died just 4 months later. The loss was a bitter blow, redoubling Ferdinand's frantic desperation. He needed a son, a strong, healthy prince to secure the future. By the following year, the queen was pregnant again. But the pregnancy was difficult, plagued by complications. On December 26, 1818, Maria Isabel went into a difficult labor. The hours dragged on, and her condition worsened until she fell into a state of unconsciousness, her breathing shallow, her pulse faint. The court physicians, panicked and believing her to be dead, made a horrific decision. Desperate to save the child, who they thought might still be alive in the womb, they prepared to perform a cesarean section. As the surgeon's knife cut into her flesh, the queen was jolted back to consciousness by the searing agony. She let out a single, terrible scream and then died, this time for good. The child, another daughter, was extracted from her womb, only to die within minutes. The scene was one of unimaginable butchery and tragedy, a grotesque spectacle of medical incompetence and royal desperation. Ferdinand had his second dead wife and was still no closer to his goal. The throne room of the palace was draped in black, but the king's heart was filled with a cold, determined rage. He would try again. The search for a third wife began almost immediately. The courts of Europe were canvassed for a suitable princess, a young, healthy, and hopefully fertile candidate to become the next Queen of Spain. The choice fell upon Princess Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a young woman of 16. When she arrived in Spain in 1819, the court was shocked. She was not just young. She was a child in body and mind, deeply, almost fanatically, pious and utterly naive about the physical realities of marriage. The prospect of her marital duties with the 35-year-old king, a man whose physical nature was already the stuff of fearful whispers, filled her with absolute terror. She allegedly found the entire concept of sexual intercourse to be sinful and disgusting. a belief her new husband's condition could only have confirmed in the most traumatic way imaginable. Their wedding night, and the nights that followed, were a disaster. Maria Josepha refused to consummate the marriage, locking herself away and resisting all of the king's advances. What had been a private matter of the royal bedchamber quickly escalated into a full-blown crisis of state. Ferdinand, a man accustomed to absolute obedience, was infuriated and humiliated. His virility was being publicly questioned by the terrified piety of his own child bride. The pressure on the young queen became immense. Courtiers, ministers, and ladies-in-waiting were all enlisted to persuade her, to educate her on her sacred duty to her husband and to Spain. When their secular arguments failed, the king turned to the highest authority he could. In an extraordinary move, a formal appeal was made to the Vatican. Pope Pius VII himself wrote a personal letter to Maria Josepha, gently but firmly explaining that marital relations were not sinful, but were, in fact, a sacrament, a necessary act for the holy purpose of procreation. Under the combined weight of her husband's rage, the court's incessant pressure, and a direct command from the Pope, the terrified young queen finally capitulated. The marriage was consummated, yet it remained a loveless and, most importantly, fruitless union. For 10 agonizing years, Maria Josepha lived as Queen of Spain, a prisoner of her marriage vows. She endured the psychological torment of a relationship built on fear and obligation, finding her only solace in prayer and poetry. The court watched and waited, but no pregnancy was ever announced. In May 1829, at the age of just 25, Maria Josepha Amalia died, childless. She faded away, a gentle, broken soul consumed by a role she was never equipped to play. Throughout these years of marital tragedy, Ferdinand's rule grew ever more erratic and oppressive. His physical health deteriorated alongside his psychological stability. Crippling attacks of gout left him chair-bound for long periods, his body racked with pain that only soured his already volatile temper. He became increasingly paranoid, seeing conspiracies in every corner. He governed not through his ministers, but through a camarilla, an informal clique of sycophants, cronies, and ultra-conservative advisors who catered to his worst impulses. They were his drinking companions, his confessors, and his enablers, insulating him from reality and encouraging his absolutist fantasies. This period of his reign, after a brief, forced interlude of constitutional rule from 1820 to 1823, became known as the Decada Ominosa, the ominous decade. It was a time of purges, political executions, and suffocating cultural repression. The king, trapped in a failing body and haunted by his failure to produce an heir, projected his internal misery onto his kingdom. Spain became a reflection of its monarch, stagnant, fearful, and tormented. The public image of the divinely anointed king, resplendent in portraits by Goya, was a hollow lie. The private reality was a man in constant pain, obsessed with the grotesque secret of his own body and his dynastic impotence, ruling a nation through fear because he himself was governed by it. By 1829, Ferdinand was 45 years old, a prematurely aged man broken by disease and despair. He had outlived 3 wives, buried 2 infant daughters, and the future of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain rested on the frail shoulders of his younger brother, Don Carlos. Carlos was the leader of the Apostolicos, the ultra-reactionary faction who believed Ferdinand was not absolutist enough. They saw Carlos, a man of rigid piety and unbending principle, as the true heir to the Spanish throne, and they waited eagerly for the sickly king to die. But Ferdinand was not ready to surrender. The thought of his sanctimonious brother, a man who represented everything he both envied and despised, inheriting his crown was intolerable. He would make one last, desperate gamble. He dispatched his agents to find him a 4th wife, and this time, the criteria were explicit. She had to be young, strong, from a family known for its fertility, and she had to be found quickly. The choice fell, once again, upon a niece, the 23-year-old Maria Cristina of the 2 Sicilies. She was vibrant, charming, and, most importantly, came from a family of proven breeders. She arrived in Spain late in 1829, a stark contrast to her predecessors. She was not a frightened child like Maria Josepha or a political adversary like Maria Antonia. She was an ambitious and politically astute woman who understood exactly what was required of her. To the astonishment of the court and the utter fury of the Carlist faction, the new queen became pregnant almost immediately. Ferdinand was ecstatic, his hope reignited. The entire nation held its breath. 9 months later, in October 1830, Queen Maria Cristina gave birth. The child was healthy and strong, but it was a girl, Princess Isabella. While Ferdinand was overjoyed to finally be a father to a living child, the birth plunged the court into a new crisis. According to the Salic law of succession, which had been introduced to Spain by the Bourbon dynasty a century earlier, females could only inherit the throne if there were no legitimate male heirs in the entire dynastic line, including the king's brothers. This meant that as long as Don Carlos was alive, he, not Isabella, was the rightful heir. But Ferdinand, now doting on his infant daughter and heavily influenced by his determined wife, would not accept this. He resurrected a decree his father had secretly passed in 1789, a decree that had never been formally published, which had abolished Salic law and restored Spain's traditional succession rules allowing a daughter to rule. In March 1830, even before Isabella's birth, Ferdinand had formally published this law as the Pragmatic Sanction. It was a legal and political bombshell. In a single stroke, he disinherited his brother and named his future child, whatever their gender, as his successor. This act was the point of no return. It split the country in two. On one side were the Isabelinos or Cristinos, supporters of the queen and her daughter, who tended to be more moderate conservatives and liberals hoping for reform. On the other were the Carlists, the absolutist supporters of Don Carlos, who viewed the Pragmatic Sanction as an illegal violation of sacred law and tradition. They saw it as the final betrayal by a corrupt king, manipulated by his conniving foreign wife. The stage was set for civil war. The only thing holding it back was the flickering, fading life of Ferdinand himself. His final year was a horrifying spectacle of physical decay and political intrigue. In the autumn of 1832, he suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed and barely able to speak. Believing his death was imminent, the Carlist faction, led by the Minister of Justice Francisco Tadeo Calamard, surrounded his sickbed. They preyed on the king's fear of eternal damnation, telling him that he would be responsible for a catastrophic civil war if he did not restore his brother's rights. In a moment of weakness, delirious and terrified, Ferdinand signed a decree revoking the Pragmatic Sanction. Don Carlos was once again the heir. But Ferdinand did not die. He lingered, slowly regaining a sliver of his faculties. His wife, Maria Cristina, who had been temporarily sidelined, fought back with cunning and ferocity. Aided by her sister, Luisa Carlotta, she purged the Carlist ministers from the government. In a now legendary confrontation, Luisa Carlotta is said to have confronted the minister Calamard and slapped him, snarling, "I'll kill you with my own hands." With the king's mind clearing just enough to comprehend the deception, Maria Cristina presented him with the decree he had signed. On New Year's Eve of 1832, in a final, lucid act of will, Ferdinand VII formally rescinded his revocation. He dismissed his treacherous ministers and confirmed, once and for all, that his infant daughter, Isabella, was to be his heir. He had won his dynastic battle, but he had doomed his country. The Carlists, feeling utterly betrayed, began preparing for war. King Ferdinand VII finally died on September 29, 1833. His long, agonizing decline was over. The physician who was summoned to his death chamber performed his solemn duty, preserving the body of the man who had tormented Spain for 2 decades. As he worked, cleaning and preparing the grotesque and malformed corpse, he was handling more than just the remains of a king. He was handling the evidence of a national catastrophe. The king's swollen, distorted body was a perfect metaphor for his reign. a system poisoned from within by a fundamental flaw, projecting its own dysfunction outward in the form of pain and violence. The secret Ferdinand had guarded with such paranoid ferocity was now laid bare on the embalming table, a silent testament to the origin of his monstrous obsession. The immediate aftermath of his death was exactly as he had feared. His wife, Maria Cristina, assumed the role of regent for their 3-year-old daughter, who was proclaimed Queen Isabella II. Just days later, his brother, Don Carlos, rejecting Isabella's legitimacy, declared himself King Charles V. The First Carlist War erupted, a brutal 7-year conflict that pitted brother against brother, city against countryside, and liberal against absolutist. The war was the direct, inevitable consequence of Ferdinand's final act. By securing the throne for his daughter, he had given the more moderate and liberal factions a cause to rally around, but he had also given his embittered absolutist enemies a martyr and a banner. The kingdom fractured along the fault lines he had created, plunging into a conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. The felon king was dead, but the curse of his reign had just begun. The long-term consequences of Ferdinand's rule were devastating. The Carlist Wars did not end in 1840. They would reignite twice more in the 19th century, creating a permanent source of political instability and reactionary violence. The deep division between a fractured, often ineffective liberalism and a militant, intransigent traditionalism became the defining characteristic of modern Spanish politics, a division that would ultimately culminate in the horrors of the Spanish Civil War in the 20th century. Ferdinand's reign had systematically dismantled the nascent liberal project of 1812, replacing it with a legacy of repression, military intervention in politics, and profound social distrust. He left behind not a strong, unified nation, but a broken, impoverished, and deeply polarized one, decades behind its European neighbors in political and industrial development. Historically, Ferdinand VII remains one of the most despised figures in Spanish history. There is little debate about his character. He is remembered as El Rey Felon, a cruel, duplicitous, and vindictive tyrant who consistently betrayed his own people for the sake of his own power. Even his supporters are forced to concede his personal failings, focusing instead on his role as a supposed defender of tradition against the godless tide of liberalism. Modern interpretations, however, allow for a more tragic, if not more sympathetic, reading. He can be seen as a man profoundly damaged by his upbringing and his physical condition, a victim of a genetic lottery that cursed him from birth. His tyranny can be understood not just as political ideology, but as a psychological defense mechanism, the lashing out of a man consumed by deep and abiding shame. His desperate need for control was a direct consequence of his lack of control over his own body and his own legacy. This contrast between the public monarch and the private man is the key to understanding the full scope of the tragedy. Publicly, he was the absolute king, the restorer of order, the father of his people. His official portraits show a stern, imposing figure, the embodiment of royal authority. But privately, he was a man in agony, both physically and psychologically, terrified of his own reflection, haunted by his inability to fulfill the most basic requirement of his office. His obsession with producing an heir was not just about the dynasty. It was a desperate, all-consuming need to prove to himself and to the world that he was not the monster his body suggested he was. This obsession led him to treat his wives with a clinical, utilitarian cruelty, viewing them not as partners, but as broodmares who repeatedly failed him. The deaths of Maria Isabel and Maria Josefa were collateral damage in his war against his own biology. In the end, the story of Ferdinand VII is a terrifying cautionary tale about the intersection of personal dysfunction and absolute power. It demonstrates how the secret frailties of a single individual, when amplified by the unaccountable authority of a throne, can become a source of immense and widespread suffering. His body, the source of his secret shame, became a metonym for his kingdom, malformed, dysfunctional, and a source of perpetual conflict. The physician who carefully preserved that body in 1833 was, in essence, preserving the evidence of the crime. He was encasing the origin of the poison that would flow through the veins of Spain for the next century. Ferdinand finally got the heir he so desperately craved, but the price was a kingdom fractured by civil war, a legacy not of Bourbon glory, but of blood, bitterness, and a tragedy born from the dark, hidden secret of a broken king.